As many of you will know, Anthropy and Ipsos surveyed more than 3,000 anthropists and members of the public on the state of our nation. Indeed, you may well have taken part, and if so, thank you. We are delighted to share with you a summary of the insights and reveal how the findings are helping to shape the UK's largest shared agenda ahead of our next national gathering.
It's lovely to see so many friends here who are fellow anthropists. I'm one of the fortunate of a very exclusive club. I'm not only an anthropist, but I'm also a fellow of the RSA. Look at me. So, Andy, John, we need to make sure there are more people in this elusive, exclusive club as we build together. So it's wonderful to bring together. I've been very fortunate to have known Andy for many years, and John for slightly fewer, but a number. I remember John coming to me a long time ago about this idea of a new type of organization based around conversation. And the interesting thing, as a co-founder of a new business about reimagining what journalism should look like for the future, particularly for the next generation of consumers, particularly the younger generation between 18 and 25. I now run a company whose average age of our newsroom is 25. This stuff is table stakes. This is not going to change because this next generation who are already our next generation of citizens, our next generation of voters, our next generations of employees, of people who run companies, who will be in government, who will be in business, who will be in civil society. They demand this stuff as the only way to operate in conversation, not in constant conflict. And what John is doing now with the support of the RSA is so important. I'm slightly worried about one thing. We seem to overuse the letter P. I think you said, Andy, that you had 3 Ps, and Anthropy have a P, and also global perspectives with a P. We need to use other letters. I think it's important for diversity and how we work. So that's my only challenge to John and Lucy tonight. Let's have some more letters. But Kelly, you've also been on this journey.
Yes.
We first, not the first time we met, but we met on the Anthropy journey on the train down to Cornwall and chatted.
We did. I'm also a member of the RSA,
Andy,
but I had not visited the building.
Oh, there was loads of us showing off now. But Kelly, you and I had a lovely long conversation on the train down to Cornwall for the first Anthropy in 2021, and I think we both realised there was something special here, but we also needed to have more than fantastic conversation. We needed action, as Andy was saying, and as John has always said, but also data and being able to stretch our thinking to connect with the public, as well as having an understanding of those of us who have joined the Anthropy journey. And last year, we set up this new system with you so that we could make those judgments. So Kelly, just want to take us through what we found in this first exciting report.
So that's right. So the first year of Anthropy, when I was there were some amazing conversations happening. But the ability to curate those conversations and what we knew was discussed, that was really, really tricky. And so we talked to John about trying to tap into the wisdom of the Anthropy crowd whilst people were in situ, but then also follow up with them and get some more reflections afterwards. And then if you're going to gather the thoughts of anthropists, sure, wouldn't you want to know how they compare to the general population and what the citizens of the country think are the top priorities, what they think Britain needs to do for the future, and have a look at how the two work together? And so that's what we attempted to do. So I'm delighted to be here to talk you through this first ever Insights report for Anthropy. In it, you will find the results, and you will have hard copies outside. Inside, you'll find the results from both research undertaken with anthropists after the event, 765 in total, plus 120 interviews which were undertaken on site during the day, and then AI-assisted analysis of the transcripts from all of the sessions that were transcribable from the November event itself. There's a huge wealth of data from the Anthropy community. You will also find, for key questions which we have tried and tested with the general public, the responses from the general public to those questions as well. So it does make for an interesting read. On the 765 anthropists, what we know about them are that they are more likely to be from the third sector or the private sector. They are, on average, older than the general population when you look across the statistics, and they tend to be in senior ranking roles. So that is worth bearing in mind, which means you have an incredible degree of influence amongst the Anthropy community. The public, that is nationally representative and at scale where you can have a look between regions and different demographic groups as well, which you can go into in the wider data set if you really are a data geek, which some of you might be, you never know. So the main findings from this year. So we asked about top priorities and what anthropists felt were the biggest issues facing the country today. And the top answer among anthropists was 32% said pollution, environment, climate change in that general bucket is the biggest single issue facing Britain today. For the general population, this is where I start guessing. Did the general population higher or lower? No, I kid you. We do proper research at Ipsos. For the general public, this is in November, the biggest concern was inflation and prices. It's not to say that they don't care about the environment, and I'll come to that in a minute, but it was not the top issue facing the British public as they considered it at that time. But let's look at the top three. And what do we see from anthropists? Well, for the top three, they tend to be issues which are particularly complex, need a lot of collaboration in order to be able to tackle, and they are somewhat different from what we find the public have as the top three on their agenda. Pollution, environment, climate change, poverty and inequality, and then thirdly, a lack of faith in politics, politicians, and government. The general public, these issues are things that they perceive as immediate concerns. And I mentioned inflation and prices, NHS and the economy. If I ask this question today, and you know what, I do ask this question today. I asked it in February, I asked it in March. They're still the top three, they're just in a slightly different order. And so if you look at the concerns between the two groups, there are differences here which are worth thinking about. But does this mean the general public don't care about the long term and the state of the country at large? Absolutely not. 6 in 10 think things in the country are heading in the wrong direction. Almost half say that the government focuses too much on short-term planning. Amongst anthropists, this was 94%. And only 11% expect better opportunities for young people over the next few years. Half believe the opportunities are going to get worse. This is amongst the general public. So they absolutely do care about the longer term. They're just firefighting problems of today. So we ask anthropists about the change that they want to see, and this data comes from all the different sources where we gather data from anthropists at the event, after the event, and during those sessions. And when you draw it all together and you try to pick out key themes from it, there were 8 that emerged as the most dominant themes. Firstly, political and electoral reform. This was about whether or not there was true representation in the electoral system. It was about engaging citizens in politics in a more meaningful way, and about government taking longer term views, specifically on some of those key issues that need tackled. Children and young people, about representation of them in decision making, and also considering homes, skills, and things that really matter to young people's future, jobs. Investment in public health services, on economy and prosperity, specifically around local, national, and global. Cross-sectoral collaboration, which isn't a surprise given the groups of people that came together and they want to focus on collaboration. Climate change, natural places, preparing for a green economy, educational reform, specifically a lot around lifelong learning, and then addressing inequality. So you might look at that and think, God, that's everything. It's not everything. Where's migration? It's not migration, it's not policing, there's a huge amount of things that were not coming out as those top thematic areas where anthropists thought there should be more of a focus and more of a priority. So what about the future? What about the future of this country on a global stage? And again, we asked anthropists that question. Now, we give them a range of options, and you can see that Both anthropists and citizens are divided on the answer to this question. Looking ahead to 20 years' time, which of these two descriptions of the UK's role in the world, if either, balanced question, do you think will be closest to reality? The UK will be a small island that very few other countries pay attention to, 4 in 10 for both citizens and for anthropists. And then 25% and 30% respectively say the UK will play an important role in the world in 20 years' time. So we are divided on those things. So what would have to happen, or what do anthropists think would have to happen for the UK to be in this latter box, which is playing an important role 20 years from now? Well, the good news is anthropists at large think that the UK can be a positive influence in the world. As many as 9 in 10 agree with that statement, which is more optimistic than the British public at large, where it is only 6 in 10, but still a majority. So we think we can play a positive role. And the things that we think will get us there, well, actually, the top answer isn't this, but this is my most favourite answer. The top answer was about ethical business practices on a global stage, manufacturing, but secondary to that, our arts, our culture, our sports, our heritage, our history, which is why it's so lovely to be doing this in this particular building today. That was an accident, but a very happy accident. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thanks so much for that, Kelly. Some really interesting data there for us to pick apart. John O'Brien, founder of Anthropy. Do come and join us to rapturous applause. Rapturous applause. Thank you. And let's pick apart some of that information. As you say, Kelly, there is superficially maybe a division between what the anthropists have been telling you about what is their priorities and what the general public. You've explained a little bit about the notion of that day-to-day short-term concerns for the general public maybe aren't, and for very good reason, reflected in the same way for anthropists who are at Anthropy for a different reason. But I want to also ask whether you think there's any credence in the idea that sometimes in rather august situations that we find ourselves in, that we can be a little distant from what the public are actually concerned about. Or do you think it is just the short-term, long-term division?
I think it is definitely a mix, Kamal. But when I saw this originally, I remember phoning John. I was like, John, you won't believe what I've seen. The data is quite different between the anthropists and citizens. But actually, the more I reflected on it, it was resonating a lot with what we tend to see. When we talk to business influencers or very senior people, and we ask them questions like, are you using generative AI as part of your daily jobs? Or are you playing with it? Huge proportion, nearly 9 in 10 say yes. And then you ask them, and are the public using it too? Oh, yes. Yes. They're all using ChatGPT. It's very popular. 9% of the British public have played with ChatGPT in the last 6 months. So we tend to live often with a less clear perspective on what the broader society are thinking or feeling at a particular moment in time, especially if we are ourselves perhaps in a high-performing business role where you're thinking about the long term all the time. It's literally your job. So yes, but ultimately, everybody here will also be facing those short-term pressures. You know, we're not devoid of the short-term pressures that you saw listed on that, the NHS. We'll have family members on waiting lists for operations. We too will be facing extremes on prices, etc. So it's just the ability to think longer term, and that's what makes Anthropy so special, because you have a group of people here who have the potential and the ability to think longer term and to make change happen, and that was clear from this data.
John, can I ask you something similar? I mean, how do we make the connection between maybe the public, it's obviously a grotesque term in a way because obviously the public think many, many different things, but just in a general sense, how do we connect the conversations that you have sparked and many people in this room are very closely engaged in with the public's immediate concerns? Do you worry about that distance between what could be described, if you were being critical, this ivory towers thing. Well, you're over there talking about all that stuff, and that's all great, lovely, and isn't it all lovely for you lot? Here, I am really worried about the day-to-day.
Yeah, and I just want to start by thanking Kelly, you and the team for doing an extraordinary piece of work over the last 6 months. And actually, I should share that there were half a dozen people in this room who were consulted on the results. And when they use the word brave, you know, when they say you're going to be brave if you put this out, for the very reason that you cite, in the potential risk of criticism for people saying exactly what you said, oh, these people that call themselves anthropists are completely out of touch with what's happening in the rest of the country. Well, actually, for the reasons that Kelly's explained, you know, I think the continuity is because we have always put the thought into anthropist mindset that it should be longer term thinking and looking at those issues that are going to require, I suppose, a reaction to the criticism around short term thinking, which we also alluded to. But from my perspective, you could argue that it would all be very nice if everybody had agreed and it was all the same. That would be very nice and tidy. But we don't live in a tidy world. Some of the most beautiful things actually aren't designed to be tidy. I think the critical thing about this, and which we have worked on, which we'll present in a little moment now, is that Anthropy cannot afford to be anything but relevant to what everybody else thinks is happening in this country. And I don't think anthropists are out of touch at all, but we are posing them the question of what are the longer term issues. There is a correlation between many of those issues, but what we are doing as anthropists is trying to look for the wider sense of everybody in this country about the efficacy of action coming out of our agenda. So I'm not sure, this is where I will get it wrong, so I'm not sure if this is the time that I can put a slide up to just illustrate this.
Oh, I could click.
Well, have you
Yes.
got a click?
Back.
Back, yeah. So you're not rehearsed. But one of the specific outcomes of this is the launch of the alliances. So tonight, aligned with the priorities that are in this report, we are also launching both national alliances around specific thematics, which very much correlate both anthropy thinking and the public's thinking. But also what I'm really keen on is that this is not a London conversation held in Cornwall. We have got to get regional perspectives, regional priorities. So although we don't have complete national coverage yet, obviously the people in this room are really critical to getting out and getting more people involved so that we can bring regional voices in, where I think more of the general public concerns on a more sort of day-to-day basis are likely to come through those activities personally. And I will just go on to the next slide actually, just to share that these are the first chairs which we're announcing tonight of our alliances, which will roll out over the summer. So I thank everybody here who's showing the leadership in taking that next stage of Anthropy, which is getting action between the annual or the national gatherings.
I think there are two very important points there, John. It's lovely to see that thinking on geography, which is so important in terms of the conversations we have, that the perspectives are different from around the UK and obviously from around the world. I think the other thing as well for us as anthropists and for us to think about is social income and economic background, and how can we involve people with very different perspectives on the demands, because it'd be wrong, Kelly, wouldn't it, to set up cost of living as if it is against climate change. What has happened in some of the discourse when we're talking about climate change is that somehow the cost of living issues that many people have found increasingly intense as we've had this dose of inflation out of COVID, conflict, particularly sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has somehow been set against the notion of long-term plan. Climate change is all great, but it's not for now. What's your sense of the public? Is that really where the public is, that they are seeing one as a trade-off against the other, or is there more nuance in the polling evidence that you're seeing?
So there's always more nuance, first of all, worth saying. However, so we put out some research today. It's Earth Day, as was mentioned earlier, so of course we've done some research globally, but we've been looking at this issue and what the public think of it for some time, and we have seen a softening of urgency amongst the general population. And that is more so amongst the lower socioeconomic groups, actually, and we've seen that come through. The other thing that's quite interesting is a sense of apathy amongst younger generations as well. Like, this challenge is so big, we don't think it, like, it's really hard and it's really difficult, and a real sense of apathy coming through, particularly younger men. Which is another, we've quite a few interesting trends amongst younger males at the minute coming through as a group. So I think whilst there's a fair degree of nuance beneath the top line that you mentioned, ultimately reduction in sense of urgency and also a sense of apathy coming through, which is different from what we've seen in the past, where it has been more just general concern, urgency.
Yeah. And John, I think that seems to increase the need for this notion of collaboration and collaborative conversations involving lots of different voices. I think what's been fascinating about the journey you want Anthropy to go on is that it's not just a lot of people in a room agreeing with each other, and that we need to collaborate and challenge ourselves in the types of conversations we're having. And I think, Kelly, it's fascinating. We've seen a lot of data, you know, amongst young people who we deal with every day around this possible divergence between male and female attitudes to what might be considered progressive issues of equity between genders, around ethnicity, sexual orientation, all the protected characteristics. And also, as you say, climate. I mean, John, what does it put on the table for us as anthropists to be thinking intentionally about how we collaborate in a way that doesn't just add to this notion of us and them?
Well, I mean, as many of you know, one of the key concerns I had 3 years ago was the fact that, you know, to me, the sort of national discourse, the narrative is always about disagreeing with people rather than finding areas that you could agree on. And I think that's been a polarization in society from Brexit onwards, which actually I think encouraged a lot of people to get involved in Anthropy. We have to have a different forum where we can respectfully agree with people, or disagree, I would say. You know, and actually, so this cannot be an echo chamber. And I know, you know, I sometimes get accused by, you know, after each of the gatherings, people have said, oh, well, yes, but everybody's agreeing. Actually, I know that not everybody in this room agrees on everything. I know that you all think I agree with you because I play that role.
You're very polite, John.
Well, you know, but the reality is I know that people in this room and at Anthropy do not agree on everything, but we have, through both the ambience of doing it at Eden, it's tremendous to have the Eden team here this evening, which is a very different environment, as everybody knows, and also what we encourage in our directive, I suppose, to the way in which people conduct, to try and have in a conversation which, I suppose, from my own perspective, was the sort of conversation that we would have had years ago, before social media, etc., where you sort of hide behind the tweet and you hide behind the post. Well, you can't hide if you're sitting in the rainforest there, close up. So we have to have the right level of friction, the creative use of disagreement in order to find the common way forward. And I will say, I mean, one company said to me after year one, John, we need more disagreement. It's got to be more like, I mean, you're the journalist, it's got to be more like Question Time. And, you know, you've got to get people totally opposed to each other and do that. And I said, no, hang on a minute. We've got that everywhere else. So I absolutely, and with the team and with everybody involved in the agenda and the alliances, need to navigate this, I think, for the greater good of the country, where there is at least one location where you can go and have a civilized conversation, disagree with somebody, but be sensible and respectful about it. Because I think that's the only way we're going to get through the sort of situation that we're in at the moment.
Of course, two locations, John, Anthropy and the RSA, of course.
Well, of course, yes.
Yeah.
Well, wherever Anthropy moves around, you know.
Kelly, can you talk us through, so Andy talked about the sort of the triumvirate, and those of us who've maybe studied politics will remember back to the notion, the sort of Buxkerlike notion of government, business, and employees in the form of unions being the three groups that would come together, the three sort of that would come together, collaborate, and that would be the way forward. I'm struck, though, by the public's attitude and, frankly, the anthropists' attitude to politicians being able to play their part in that triumvirate. You had some positive words about ethical business practices, which was good to see. I think when you consider civil society, there's a warmth, or there's an optimism about what can be achieved by many non-profit or non-commercial groups. But when it comes to politicians, everyone's kind of, I don't really believe they're going to do what they need to do. I mean, is there any evidence to counter that? How do we re-engineer optimism in what politics can achieve?
Well, firstly, I'll start with politicians have always been quite low on the trustworthiness monitor that we conduct, though they reached a new low in the last couple of years. And you did see that they are an issue on the issues index for the anthropists. There were not as many politicians in the room, perhaps, as other anthropists, so they couldn't stand up for themselves. But also, we had, in the index for citizens, that lack of faith in politics. It is a top 10 issue, and it has been bumping around that top 10 for a couple of years now as well. So there's a fundamental issue around trust in politicians, politics, etc. So it wasn't a surprise to me that it was up there, but of course it does provide a challenge when you're looking to move forward in a democracy where both the population and certainly some of the major business, charitable leader, influencers don't have a lot of faith in the political system to help get stuff done, which is why, again, Anthropy and the community at Anthropy and the movement at Anthropy becomes even more important, and engaging the politicians from all sides of the debate in this conversation will become increasingly critical as it gains more momentum.
John, what do you want to say about this notion of, for many people, anthropists, the general public, who obviously cross over, this notion of trust in politics, and what could Anthropy's role be there?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I would say is that I think that cynicism around politics and politicians is a terrible thing for the country, and it's not going to do us any service if it is continued promulgated or laughed about, whatever the case may be. We have politicians in the room tonight, and we have people that work politically across the spectrum. And I actually respect, and I know that everybody in this audience would respect those people that choose to put their effort and their life, or their work into the field of politics. But one of the things that reaction endorses, to my mind, is that actually we as a society have tended to get into a situation, I believe, where we think it's their fault. It's their problem. We tick a box every few years, and they need to get on and solve this. Writing a check or making an initiative or whatever. That is not the way that this country needs to be led. I mean, in the past I've said, and perhaps I shouldn't say it, but I have said the joke in the past that the future is too important to be left purely to the politicians. But actually what I mean by that is that we have a collective responsibility, because actually in this room alone, we have extraordinary number of influential people from different organisations across all sectors. And it's just not good enough for us to think that those in Westminster are the ones that must find the solution. If we care significantly about this country, and that's what anthropists are about, then they need to have that desire to be part of the solution. In terms of the general public attitude, of course that is driven by scandals, disappointments, the media, etc., etc. But we're all in this together. And I think what's happened with politicians recently, particularly where there's been threats, where people are, hounded out of their homes and things like that, I think that's absolutely appalling. That is not the Britain that I grew up in. That is not the way in which we treated our leaders, our politicians, and it shouldn't be the way in which we would hope the future of our society should be. So that's a little high horse that I've jumped on. But I mean, if Anthropy's got anything to do...
You can't have a little high horse.
Yeah,
So high horses, yes.
It's to embrace politicians, it's to bring them into the agenda, and let's build that respect out in that way as well.
Yeah. Kelly, just finally, before we come towards some closing thoughts from John, some of the figures that you see, and I think you're right, John, actually, to point out I'm the journalist in the room. Journalists tend to sometimes bend to the bleak. We need to be careful. I think the media has a responsibility in this space as well. But I'm interested in the journey that business has had in this trust barometer approach, and maybe if there's anything you can add longitudinally to this. Business has been through these huge dips, particularly after the financial crisis around trust, and particularly in banking. But then I was at that stage business editor at the BBC, and you could see that the banking crisis led to this complete diminution in trust in the way business operated. And I just wondered, Kelly, are there any lessons there for us as anthropists in those slightly more positive sense I felt you were giving us around the public's faith that ethical business could be a way forward. To John's point, it's not just all about politicians, that maybe could transfer to the political sphere. And just to say, of course, that in the election that is likely to be obviously this year and has to be at its very latest next January, we will be back to a rather traditional banker versus a lawyer, which is something that we haven't had for a little while. So at least some of the traditions will be coming back.
Positive reflection to finish on, Kamal.
But Kelly, give me some thoughts on has that business journey, does that help us think a little bit? What did business do to slightly start ticking those numbers up again?
So there's lots of academic research actually on this, as well as commercial research on what drives trustworthiness. And there are a range of criteria, from doing what you say you will, being perceived to be well led, to being perceived as acting in the other person's interests. And it is there are 7 different indicators actually, and for certain types of business from different types of sector. The tech sector in particular was seen as being particularly well led, and a lot of the very snazzy, trendy CEOs that were going out into the press, that was something that the public were resonating with for the tech sector, until they had a more challenging couple of years, of course. So there are things that fundamentally shift trust, and it is a series of indicators, and not just there's not one magic bullet. And we looked at this, we actually looked at which of these things correlated with being perceived as trustworthy, and all of them correlated to different degrees, to different sectors and different industries. And so there's not a magic bullet, I'm afraid, Kamal.
I think that would be wonderful, Kelly, to maybe bring that to the table at Anthropy, about what are those trust indicators and how can we fulfill them in a way that gains trustworthiness rather than demands trust, which is a completely different way of looking at things. So that's a fabulous final point.
Anthropy is based on 2 principles. The first being that the future of our country is a shared responsibility. The second is dynamic stewardship, the fact that we are custodians of our great institutions, our natural landscape, our heritage, our laws, and much more. But if they're going to be fit for the rest of this century and beyond, then it's our job as custodians to shape them for the future. Anthropy affords the ability for you as leaders to join us in helping create that national agenda, either through our national gathering or through our alliances around the country. Do consider helping shape the future of Britain through Anthropy.